Atomic commits look very nice, but who in reality is this structured when implementing a change? Well, let me tell you a secret. I often cheat and rely on some strategies to make it look like I'm structured. And in this video, I'm going to share my strategies with you. By the way, I'm using air quotes because I don't really think these are strategies. I also don't think it's cheating, and to be completely honest, you might even be disappointed because much of it is simple and obvious stuff. But it works for me, so maybe it'll work for you too. First, let's add a little bit of context. The comment was made in response to my first atomic commits video, and the example in that video was really simple. The actual functional change was just the ability to log out. A logout button and a state change, basically. Everything else was stuff I discovered along the way. Why is this important? Because the more complex a feature is, the more time you should spend preparing to make it. And there's a lot to be said about planning, structuring, and slicing features, but I won't talk about any of it, at least not in this video. For two reasons. One, if the reaction to my simple example is, whoa, who's actually this structured, we don't have to talk about more complex scenarios yet. And two, even if you spend a fair amount of time planning and you think you've mapped it all out, reality will hit you once you start working. There will be things you didn't anticipate, changes you didn't expect to make, temporary hacks you've forgotten about, problems that only become visible once you zoom in. For some reason, our job is just like that. Some of these things might send you back to the drawing board, but most, they're just nuisances and you can deal with them. And that's what this video is about. When you want to do something, but you realize you have to change something else first, or that changing something else first would make your change easier, or that something's broken in the current implementation, or that the code just looks like shit. The basic rule is, if you do one thing and discover another, don't mingle those things together. Make a separate commit for each. And you don't have to be some crazy strategist to pull this off. Here's what I do. First, I ask myself, do I really have to do it now? Just because I discovered something doesn't mean I have to do it right away, or in some cases, even at all. Asking this question is really important because developers sometimes do these displacement activities when it gets a little harder, when you get stuck or have to make a decision, you stare at the screen and there it is, a typo, an unused method, and what kind of idiot wrote that nested ternary expression? You discover things that can be easily fixed and look so attractive right now, little dopamine hits that leave you with the feeling that you've made the world better. And in a way you did, but you also didn't make progress on the thing you were supposed to be working on. Plus, and this is important in this context, you added changes to your working copy that are unrelated to what you're doing. I'm not saying you shouldn't make these changes, but if they don't block you from finishing your current change, just write them down on a piece of paper, your to-do list, your hand. It doesn't really matter. Just write them down. Tackle it after you've committed the current change or at the end of the session or somewhere in between, depending on how important and necessary the change really is. Prioritize. But of course, you can't defer everything. Sometimes you're in the midst of something and you realize you have to make this other change first. If you've ever wondered what git stash is for, this is it. At least according to me, because I hardly use it for anything else. And there's not much to say really. Stash your current changes, make the other change, commit, pop the stash, and move on. It's that easy. But sometimes you have to go deeper. You've already stashed something and now while working on the next thing, it happens again. But guess what? You can stash again. Stash as often as you want. As long as you move quickly and don't lose track of what you're doing, I don't see a problem. There's actually something very satisfying about going in and out of a Stashception. Once you've reached the end and go back up, changes you were previously working on typically become easier and you end up with a nice logical sequence of commits. However, you should also realize that repeated and deep Stashceptions mean you didn't prepare well enough for the task. And while it might work, sometimes the better approach is to take a break and do some planning. People who prefer individual commits over big squashed ones often do this because the commits tell a story. Something that reflects what happened during development. However, I don't think these stories need to be ultra accurate accounts of every single step or misstep taken. Interactive rebasing allows you to rewrite history. Of course, only if you're working locally or the remote branch is truly yours. If it's shared, maybe if you synchronize with your teammates. I use it to make my stories look a little nicer than they actually were. And this is not just to make myself look less like an idiot, it's mostly to make it less annoying for others to read. Here are some things I do regularly. Sometimes I realize I've forgotten something that belongs to a previous commit. For example, I missed an edge case. So I make the change, make a commit, and then squash it into the commit where it belongs. The opposite may also happen. I slipped in a file that didn't belong there, or I discover there's more work to do on something, but this would make the original commit too unfocused, and it would have been better if those were two separate commits, so I go back to the original commit and split it up. It doesn't happen very often, but sometimes I realize I approached the problem in the wrong order, and now I've got the start at the end in the middle, and there are still some parts missing. I'm sure some people don't care about this at all, but I do. So when necessary, I reorder commits to get them in a logical order. Some of the things you discover may not even be in the scope of your feature and shouldn't be part of your story. If you discover a bug, you probably want it fixed immediately and to get it out. So you do it on main, not your feature branch, right? I also like to treat more general changes like this if they assist my feature. And this implies they're at least partially in the scope of the feature. It's for situations when you work on something and then realize, if this were more like this, it would be so much easier. And not just for this feature, but also the one my teammate is working on, or the next one coming up, or maybe the system in general. Sometimes we have these epiphanies, small or big, when pieces fall into place and you're like, damn, why didn't I see that before? And again, some people probably don't care where you make that change as long as you make it. But I like to do these kinds of changes on main and then rebase my feature branch on top of it. Sometimes you have to create a mess in order to build something clean. I do this mostly when I don't know what I'm doing, which is when I'm prototyping or I'm exploring a new library or service I want to integrate. Making atomic commits in these situations is like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle without knowing what the picture looks like. Sure, you can do it, but you'll be slower and make your life harder for no good reason. So the situation is this. You've got a working copy full of changes and now you want to turn it into a nice story. Here's how I do it. I commit this whole mess to a new branch. Let's call it the draft branch. And now I want to tell a nice little story on another branch, the story branch. I switch to the story branch and introduce the first set of changes, the beginning of my story, from the draft branch. These changes can be whole files or just individual hunks. It's one of the rare cases where I actually prefer my IDE over the Git CLI because I find it easier. Once I've picked all the changes I need, I do a final check to see if I want to add some finishing touches. If I haven't written tests, for example, I'm going to retrofit them now. Once I'm done, I make a commit and give it a nice message. Next, I switch to the draft branch and rebase it onto my story branch. If there are conflicts, I'm going to resolve them. This shouldn't be too hard because they're essentially a subset of the same changes. Oftentimes, I can accept whatever is in the draft branch. However, most of the time, I'm a control freak and do it manually. Once I'm done, I finish the rebase operation. What happens now is that the changes I've picked disappear from the draft branch. I go back to the story branch and repeat the process. With each iteration, the draft branch gets smaller and smaller until there are no changes left. There's no chance of forgetting something. This one's not my favorite, but it has proven useful. It works best if the implementation in your draft branch is identical or very close to what you want to have. If you make a lot of changes in this process, you'll most likely get conflicts when rebasing your draft branch. This can be a little tedious, but still work. However, you should carefully consider if it's really worth it. And this is basically it, the things I do to get atomic commits. So tell me, does working like this make me structured, or am I just good at faking it? Of course, it'll always be easier and more convenient to work until you're finished and make one big commit, but being able to identify isolated changes is a valuable skill. If you can do that, the only other thing you need is maybe a little discipline to follow through and make individual commits. That said, I know there's lumpers and splitters, and I'm clearly a splitter. I'll probably never be able to take the perspective of a lumper. So if you're like, yeah, that looks nice, but also like a lot of work and I really don't want to do that, and I also don't see how this is better than what I'm doing, well, then don't do it. I'm just sharing what works for me. This is not the only or true way, and this is not a forced conversion. Do whatever works for you. Okay, that's it for today. See you next time.